Thank you, Noreen. I was daydreaming there, thinking I was two or three other people. I thought Madeline, my wife, was going to go before me, and I knew she would have to leave early to collect our son, who has to be picked up in Kinnegad at 5. And I was going to use the line, "She never listens to me anyway," but you've blown that. My vision for 2030, if I were to summarise it, it overlaps a lot with Martin's, but it would be the end of apartheid for people with disability. Now, I'm speaking out of my own experience, which has been in the area of people with intellectual disabilities, including many people with autism. And I'm speaking out of 41 years of such experience. I retired 4 weeks ago. I want to really thank Morgan for dragging me out of retirement in such a distressing way, so immediately. But I worked 25 years as a clinical psychologist, probably more accurately as a developmental psychologist, spanning clinical and educational psychology. And then I worked for 16 years as the CEO of the Marisa Foundation. And that's been a very privileged vantage point because I've had a ringside seat in the lives of several hundred individuals, and a ringside seat that played out over 41 years. And what really strikes me about the people that I have had the privilege of seeing up close is the huge variation in how their lives have worked out. Variation in terms of social networks, capacities, inclusion, the person's sense of themselves, their capacity to contribute. Huge variation, notwithstanding that many of them would have registered very, very similarly on diagnostic and developmental tests during the early childhood period that Martin was talking about. So in this presentation, my focus is going to be on underscoring the lessons at the individual level of your brother, your son or daughter, or you yourself, and how you can have a life worth living, a full life, a life that offers you a sense of deep connection, real purpose, a life that affirms that you have something to offer, that you have a contribution to make. So I'm not going to be focusing, the Minister will be relieved about this, I'm not going to be focusing on the legislative or policy landscape in 2030, how we might better articulate the rights or anti-discrimination laws, not because these things aren't relevant or legitimate or add value, but such changes in and of themselves are not going to deliver for your family member. I'm talking here very much to family members. They're not going to deliver this vision of a going somewhere full, non-time wasting, inclusive life. So I'm going to eschew all of the bigger political issues, and I'm reminded of the sentiment which summarized the Soviet Union experience when they used to say, Politburo meetings boil no potatoes. And I suppose my message here today is you've got to boil your own potatoes. And it's you, not the state, not the HSE, not service providers who will seal the deal of inclusion, of belonging, and purpose for your family member. So I have three central messages that I want to get across. The first one is do whatever you can to maintain your family member in the ordinary traffic flows of life. I heard a snippet on the radio about 10, 15 years ago. Somebody was asking a management consultant, how do you get lucky in life? And how do you get lucky in business? And the answer was, get in the traffic and stay in the traffic. I think we need to interrogate very skeptically any recommendation to suspend the individual's presence in the everyday traffic of life to access the supposed benefits of special programs in segregated settings. That's my first message. Second message is that we should appreciate that professionals with particular knowledge have a legitimate and value-adding contribution to make, while recognizing that in the grand scheme of the individual's life, in the grand scheme of how their life will evolve, the contribution of professionals will be secondary, will be marginal. That's not to delegitimize any of it or to invalidate it, but it's going to be secondary and marginal. And in any case, it can be delivered in non-segregated settings, and it can be challenged to be applied in a way that deepens the person's capacity to engage with the life around them. My third message is that we need to invest intentionally. I'm thinking about your conversations with your mother, perhaps here, Fionnuala, that we need to invest intentionally, urgently, and relentlessly with the ordinary experiences, opportunities, and challenges that present. And it's the investment in this zone that makes the critical difference. And my experience over 41 years is that what differentiates the people, and that huge variation, is the capacity and the relentlessness with which families have sought those opportunities and have invested in them. There's a couple of confusions or distinctions that we need to clarify. I think Fionnuala has touched on this already, the difference between impairment and disability. And a second confusion that often arises is the confusion between the specific support that's needed and the context in which it's delivered. So obviously impairment is the core imperfection or deficit. So I'm visually impaired, but because I have these, though they're not working so well this afternoon, it doesn't translate into a disability. What converts an impairment into a life-limiting and life-denying disability is either lack of support or poorly directed support within the various systems. So Martin has touched on that in terms of early childhood. You've touched on it in terms of education, employment, community. And support can be poor for a number of reasons. It can be the wrong kind of support. It could be the right kind of support, but not enough of it. It's relevant support, but it's offered in the wrong context. And another key message of mine is that context is critical. So what I mean by context is the physical setting in which the person spends a lot of their time, the other kind of people in that setting, the formal language that's used to describe the place and the kind of programs that are in it, the identity of the staff that are there, the activities pursued within, and then the whole paraphernalia of signage, imagery, location. So why is context such a big deal? It's such a big deal because context frames everything. And critically, context frames meaning. How you are perceived, how you perceive yourself, what expectations people will hold of you, what expectations you will hold of yourself, and the powerful assumptions that Martin referenced. So where the rubber really hits the road in terms of context is whether the context defines you as one of us or whether the context defines you as other. And this goes to the heart of the matter, because whether you are included as one of us or whether you are othered and marginalised is absolutely critical. We're all sensitized to the dangers of marginalisation for minority groups. So we know about the homeless, we know about refugees, we know about people with criminal convictions. And we know that the consequences of being marginalised are serious. People who are marginalised are excluded from opportunities. People hold deeply powerful and unhelpful assumptions about them. These take root, they spread, they reinforce. All kinds of social distancing dynamics kick in. Critically, when you're marginalised, you deprive others of the kind of experiences that they need to learn how to interact with you. And it's striking that when people have those experiences, they often comment, sure, it's no big deal, but it's all this stuff I had in my head. Marginalisation also leads to higher tolerance for all kinds of bad things happening to you. So, it's a fact that you're much more likely to be the subject of various kinds of abuse. But even less dramatically than that, there's a higher tolerance for the time wasting. You referenced Fionnuala. Higher tolerance for neglect, for poor outcomes, higher tolerance for going nowhere, and going nowhere with no sense of urgency that you need to be going somewhere else. Maybe it's a bit rich for me to say this as somebody who's earned his crust in services, but specialist service settings marginalise people. They write them out of the community story. And this isn't a theoretical or academic observation. It's a real phenomenon, it's a real process, and it has very real consequences. We recognise marginalisation with typical minority groups because there's a language around that, and that language is typically very negative, harsh, often very hostile. But we tend not to recognise that in our space because the language is well-intentioned, it's benevolent, it's often sentimental, sometimes well-intentioned kind of compassionate paternalism, but paternalism nonetheless. And we often fall into the trap of thinking that because the language is coming from a benevolent space, that the effects must be benign and can't be malign. But that is not the case. So I believe, if I have one core message to give, that is that we need to maintain the person on the right side of the line, the side of the line that keeps them as one of us rather than other. And we need to do that, we need to maintain them in that space at all times if possible. But if families find that they have no option but to occasionally cross over, my advice would be that they need to not beat themselves up about that, but they need to minimize this time. And at the earliest possible opportunity, they need to get the person back across the other side of the boundary line. Those people who are working in these specialist settings might encourage you to relax. Where's the rush? Isn't this comfortable? And they're taking that line not because they're bad people or because there's some kind of weird conspiracy going on or because there's something sinister going on. They may, however, be people who are complacent about the costs you are absorbing by virtue of the time out from the ordinary traffic flows. Okay. They're also likely to have an inadequate sense of urgency, and they may even genuinely believe that your exposure to qualified and specialist input and support is of a higher value than what awaits you on the other side of the line. So my advice to you is be wary of this pleasant and plausible language. So my third message, and this will go across in 1 minute, Maureen, pay attention to the ordinary, to the everyday opportunities and resources. Don't assume resources are only things which come from HSE. Make positive assumptions of capacity, both of your family member, but also of the community. Raise the bar of expectations. Don't take reckless chances, but don't sterilize the environment for the person. Don't remove all sense of risk, frustration, or failure. So it's safety first, but not safety only. Recognize the enormous value of incidental learning and the enormous value of being in the zone where one thing leads to another, where opportunities spontaneously bubble up. These are the factors, I believe, which nurture development and learning in the species. And it holds for all who are admitted to membership of the club of one of us. Thank you.